Welcome back, everybody. Good morning. Our next speaker is Wendell Stevens. I think for most of us in the audience, Wendell does not need a bit of introduction, but for anybody that may not know, my personal belief is that Wendell is literally the grandfather of all modern ufology. Here is a man that was present from the very early 40s and 50s in the military, an Air Force colonel. He was actually originally stationed for those missions in the Antarctic that gathered data on the UFOs that were coming in and out at that time. And his passion for this subject has made him, I think, ultimately the #1 resource on the planet. He knows so much. He's probably forgotten more than I personally will ever know. Ladies and gentlemen, Wendell Stevens.
Good afternoon. My name is Wendell Stevens, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. It's a pleasure to see so many of my old friends coming here every season, and I welcome you again today, and I greet all the new ones. Thank you very much. Now, I wonder how many of you remember this picture or similar that appeared in your newspapers way back in 1989, 90. This is a painting of a Russian landing at Voronezh, Russia, a provincial capital 500 miles south of Moscow. Now, this is what appeared in the Phoenix newspaper. This is printed on the front page. It says, UFO captain taken prisoner by the KGB. We couldn't get the whole thing. The original microfiche had been destroyed. Can't get copies of it anymore. Would love to have them, but everybody in Arizona area saw that headline and read those papers. Here's another page from the same. And this was describing a landing that took place by this silver sphere in the provincial capital city of Voronezh in Russia in 1989. But there was a considerable preface to this that we're going to get into in a little bit here. Now, the beings that got out of that craft, when it landed, this big 9-foot tall being got out of the craft in a red coverall suit. And he talked to the crowd in the local Russian dialect, perfectly expressed. And he asked for, he talked to 400 eyewitnesses around the park there and asked them to bring a leader to the park, and they did. They brought the mayor of the city. And while the mayor is standing there talking to the giant in his native, in the native dialect of Voronezh, a KGB truck drove up. Officers got out, arrested the giant, started loading him into the KGB van, a big van, and one of them hit him on the back with the baton. He was getting in, but he went in with no resistance at all. Probably could have picked the truck up if he wanted to. And went aboard, and they drove off with him. And when he left, 2 more came out of the craft dressed in silvery suits. And they talked to the crowd in perfect local dialect also and discussed things with them. They talked to various of the stronger members of the crowd. There was a 12-year-old boy that began screaming something, and they turned the beam on him, and he disappeared, vaporized away. And the crowd was aghast as what happened to him, and they thought that the beings had killed the boy. But half an hour later, the boy appeared walking around in the crowd again. He was now calm and happy, and he was in good health. So whatever they did was a temporary thing to get control of him and put him back in a normal state. So this was caused a big upset, and the reason it got in newspapers all over the world was because there were approaches. 6 days in advance, there were approaches on the city of Voronezh by the same craft that came in from at the same altitude, the same directions. For the 6 previous days, came in at the same approach, same direction, the same speed, same angles, and 6 days in a row, and all groups all over the world were waiting, including the Russian military with helicopters and camera-equipped ground surveillance teams, all waiting, and newspaper people had gathered from all around the world, and there was pool reporters from UPS there that took pictures and put it on the news wires, and that's why it went out all around the world. There was a substantial publicity organization there on hand when this landing in Voronezh took place. So we have to wonder if it was staged for a particular reason or not. On this 7th day, the approach continued, and the pulsating ball of plasma light dimmed down to a silvery metallic sphere about 30 meters in diameter and landed in the Central Park in the middle of Voronezh before the astonished gaze of over 400 eyewitnesses. A seam opened up around the port in the side of the big craft, and a ramp slowly descended to the ground. The ramp had ridges across the surface, and a giant human being some 3 meters tall, that's 9 feet tall, and a meter across the chest, came down the steps in a red coverall, one-piece suit, and addressed a crowd of onlookers in perfect local Russian. He asked to speak to leaders, and the mayor of the city was blowing up the artist's sketch of the alien being. Here he is again, the big guy, 9 feet tall, and if you'll notice, he has a third eye, physical eye, in the center of his forehead, in addition to the other 2. All of the giants had disproportionately small heads for their size, about the size of a normal Earth human's head, but it was small for their size, and they had a third physical eye located in the center of the forehead, which seemed to be articulated independently of the other 2. Strangely, within the hour, the KGB came back and brought the first giant back to his ship and let him out with his fellows, and they stood there at attention while he and his fellows re-entered the big ship, and it took off with a whistling sound and rapidly disappeared. It is known that Vladimir Putin was a rising KGB functionary in that area at that time, and so one has to wonder just who authorized the release of their prized prisoner so soon. Could it have been him, Putin, or President Gorbachev himself? Putin did in fact succeed to the presidency of Russia after Gorbachev. Was this Voronezh landing a confirmation of all that had secretly preceded it in the Gorbachev family? Were the alien visitors the mentors of Gorbachev who single-handedly took the world out of its Cold War stance and thus saved it from its headlong rush to mass suicide for the entire planet and all life on it? We wanted to invite Mr. Gorbachev to come here to this conference, but were unable to make contact with him. With this most spectacular UFO contact in the whole world under their belts, the Russians eventually decided to take somebody else in on their big event. Now, this was all happening secretly up to this point. Now, not liking the Americans very much, the Russians chose Senor Pedro Romniak of Argentina, a world-renowned and respected UFO researcher like the Heineck of South America. They invited him to come to Russia at their expense and view their collected information. They even provided him a translator, and he went. After viewing their evidence for a number of days, he was invited to meet the Gorbachev family in person, where he learned of their indigo child, Aldis. We never heard of that before. He did not get all the dialogue in his book from them, from the Gorbachev family, but found that when he needed such dialogue, when he was writing it up in the narrative that would come to him in a form of automatic writing, word by word, automatically, transmitted by some means from somewhere else. He felt that the inspiration was coming from them, those who had put Aldis in the family in the first place. It was a remarkable story, and actually a demonstration of the concern that other levels of consciousness have for us and the survival of our planet as a living being. We really should pay more attention to such things when they come about. This, then, is the narrative that General Pedro Romniak published in his book, Aldes. Now, when I was down there 2 years ago in 1990, in September I think it was, I visited Pedro again. He was a man about my age. He was 86, I was 86 at the time. We both began investigating UFOs about 60 years ago. He was a pilot in the Argentine Army Air Force down there when I was a pilot in our Army Air Force up here. We grew up with similar careers. He had best become the head of their Argentine Aeronautics Association. I didn't become head of ours, but I continued in our military service, as he did too. He was a world researcher. He was probably the best known UFO researcher all over South America, and he had written 18 books. And I had about 6 of his books on hand when I visited him. So when I see that his total had grown considerably, I bought all the rest of the books. And when I got home, I read them one by one, leaving the book titled Aldes last, because it was not a very impressive title and didn't say a whole lot about UFOs, but it did have a picture on the cover. And I finally read the book, and I found that it was truly the most interesting book of the whole lot of 18, that it was remarkably done, and that it had a lot of information in it that we never heard before. So, who was Aldes? Aldes was born in Moscow in March of 1977. He was born in a painless, he was a large baby, he was 10 pounds when he was born, and he was born in a painless childbirth, happily felt by the mother. How many of you ever experienced something like that? He was born in perfect health and grew rapidly. The name Aldes sprang suddenly into the mind of Raisa, and she couldn't get it out of her mind. So they named him Aldes. Simple name. The baby's intellectual capacity was unequaled. He walked at 10 months, began to talk clearly and in whole sentences by the end of the first year. He spoke in precise terms and asked for his own room in the household, which they did. They had all the bedrooms were upstairs, so they had to create a bedroom, make up a bedroom downstairs for him. The father was promoted to a new major position in the Communist Party by the end of the first year, Aldes' first year in 1978. And he was rising in the communist hierarchy, which seemed to be guided because he was lucky all the time. He became Secretary General of a high committee in the Communist Party, Communist government, during the second year of the boy's life. And it was about that time that he fell down the stairs. He'd gone upstairs to his parents' bedroom. He fell down the stairs and was unconscious for 3 hours. When he woke up, he said, "I was with my brothers there in the sky, where all shines in brilliance and where there is total peace." And then he explained to his family the hierarchical plan. Now remember, he's just a child. He told them that the hierarchy had selected one of their scientists to take on a human body to try to influence from birth the necessary effects of change. B, the one selected must possess total dominion over self and humanity and be able to act alone on the minds of men of earth to produce concrete results. C, he must be able to complete his mission silently and anonymously. D, he must be born in a country where one man alone can control all power of the most powerful country on earth, the Soviet Union. E, Russia was selected due to its absolute dictatorship by one man alone. F, all must be controlled by one single man who could decide alone with no assistance. The mother observed the child's serenity of approach to life and being, and that the child prayed a lot. Before his second year, he began to write words and spoke in strange languages. Aldes ate little solid food and slept little, but grew rapidly and in good health. At 5 years, Aldes could read and write even in other languages that tutors were trying to teach his older sister. By 7 years, he became an advisor to his father on concepts offered his father by visitors. party functionaries who came to his house, such that on more than one occasion the boy strangely assisted the group in meetings in the home. He learned other different languages in 1 year. At 8 years old, Aldis dreamed that his father would be in an airplane accident the next day. He was dreaming downstairs, and he was so disturbed that he went upstairs, woke his father up, said, "Papa, please don't get on that airplane." And the father was going to go anyway, and he wailed and carried on till the father promised he wouldn't go. And the next morning when he got up, he canceled the flight. And the next day, after that afternoon, that flight crashed in central Russia and killed all aboard. At 8 years, he also spoke Russian perfectly and German and English as well. At 9, he looked like a boy of 12. For his 10th birthday, Aldis' father and mother took him to the leader's retreat in foliated mid-Siberia. And here he had a second accident, skiing. He was adept at all sports. He was a great skater, a good skier. He was good at everything he tried. On the third day after the retreat, skiing, he struck a tree on the ski slope and was injured, and was lost for a time when he had fallen over a cliff into a narrow ravine and got covered with snow and was out of sight. Dictator Andropov died in March of 1985. Gorbachev at that time was the leading advisor for Andropov, and Andropov was actually grooming Gorbachev to take his place as the Secretary General of the Communist Party. This was when Aldis was 11 years old, nearly 12. And he was now fluent in 4 languages, and he could also read all minds and influence thinking. So Andropov was grooming Gorbachev to take his place, and then Andropov died, and suddenly he was passed over by the Supreme Soviet, and they elected an old guard member, Chernenyenko. Chernenyenko was already ill, and he was bedridden most of the time, and Gorbachev continued as the principal advisor to the leader of Russia through Chernenyenko's reign until he died within a year of his first becoming dictator. And the Supreme Soviet was rushed into session to get a new leader immediately, and they elected Premier Mikhail Gorbachev to be Premier and Secretary General of the Communist Party. So he now became the dictator of Russia. And he had absolute power over everything. At that point, he was the most powerful man in the world alone. By now, Aldis was fluent in 4 languages and could read all minds and influence thinking. And as his father was forming a question, Aldis could perceive it in advance of the asking and was already answering it before it was fully asked. And his father became increasingly dependent on Aldis. Aldis explained reincarnation to his parents many times. Now that's interesting, a child explaining reincarnation to his parents, but they accepted it. Mikhail Gorbachev was elected supreme leader in early March of 1985. Early in 1985, and just before March of 1985, and a few weeks after election, he decided to take a break to the leader's retreat in mid-Siberia. Well, at the retreat, that first day, Mikhail decided to take a walk. This is in March of 1985, to take a walk alone in the forest there. He put on a heavy coat, snow boots, and snowshoes, and headed out. It's about mid-afternoon. He walked a mile from the cabin, sat down on a fallen log, and gazed out over a snowy meadow in front of there at a pinkish-orange pulsating light that was slowly approaching. It continued to dim down as it approached and began to lose its radiant corona. At about 15 meters in front of him, that's not very far away, in front of him it began materializing as a solid metallic sphere about 30 meters in diameter. It had taken on a reddish tone of color by this time. At 10 meters in front of him, and 2 meters to 3 meters above the ground, and 6 to 7 meters, a 6 to 7 meter diameter metal sphere that's 30 feet in diameter. No, it's 7 meters, would be 21 feet in diameter. Metal sphere hovered silently in front of him. At 2 meters above the ground, a seam opened around the portal, and a metallic ramp with cross ribs on it came slowly down to ground level. Does this sound like the Voronezh landing? This has taken place 4.5 years before that. A giant 3-meter tall being in a red coverall came down this ramp and greeted Mihail cordially. His head seemed to be disproportionately small for his size, about the size of our own head. He had a third physical eye in the middle of his forehead. The head was bald, completely bald, with no hair, and he looked friendly. He wore high gold boots and a wide belt with buttons and dials, and wore a gold circle with a blue triangle on it on his breast. Now, the painting done at Voronezh also shows the gold circle with the blue triangle in it on the breast of the big being. The big being spoke in a soft voice, "Brother, we come in peace, so that you do not destroy yourselves again as you did before some 25,000 years ago. Brother, you who are the highest in this nation now, the largest and greatest of all, now have the privilege of becoming the missionary of truth, of light, of peace, of order, and all that is awaited by the entire world. Your son Aldis is our brother, who was placed at your side by the highest to redeem the humanity of your time." During the government of Chernenko in 1984, Gorbachev controlled the Soviet destiny as chief advisor. And before the death of the title holder on 13 March 1985, he was occupying that position. Because the Chernenko was bedridden most of the time and the country was being run by advisors, the Supreme Soviet was rushed into session to get a new dictator immediately. And it so happened that 3 potential contenders for the title alongside of Gorbachev were all out of the country at the time, and Gorbachev was immediately elected by the Politburo to become the new dictator of Russia. Secretary General of the Communist Party and new leader, the youngest of all of the leaders in the line. 3 possible contenders were out of the country during the assembly. The new visitors who had said that they came from the Star Alcyon and the Pleiades had pointed out the fallacies in the Soviet system of repression and iron control, and had advocated more freedom for the 15 constituent countries that made up the Soviet Union, to allow liberty for freedom and cooperation. They had shown him how government should be more transparent and less repressive of its peoples. Now, the interesting part of this is these are the same discussions that were being advocated and carried out by the son Aldis with his father. Whenever he could engage him in conversation, he pointed out the fallacies of the Soviet dictator system, that the repression was keeping Russia from progressing and arguing for the freedoms of the peoples. And this was a continuing discussion between Aldis and his father. But it was Aldis was espousing the plan advocated by the superiors that put him in the family in the first place, and preparing Gorbachev with the ideas. Gorbachev came back from that trip, and shortly after that instituted perestroika and glasnost, carrying out the wishes of the big visitor. That took place in March of 1985. And remember, if you look back in your history, that's what, shortly after that, within 3 months after that's when perestroika and glasnost were advocated by Gorbachev. Perestroika was a structural reform, creating a new military or multi-party system and more autonomy for the constituent republics. There are 16 republics that make up the Soviet Union. It restored individual freedoms and rights, and also the rights to religions of one's choice. Also restored property rights to the people that lost it to the old communist government. Glasnost was a change of voice which changed internal procedures, creating more transparency in government. It set up a new multi-party system and provided for free elections. Now they're approaching democracy. And a new democratic president has now taken over. Gorbachev himself was freely elected to be the new president of the Soviet Union when they held their first elections. The first bloodless change in power in a very long time. A new president was elected after him, and the power changed hands again in another bloodless exchange for the first time in many years, thus demonstrating Mr. Gorbachev's own indifference to wealth and power. No other man in the whole world could have done what he did by himself alone, where he personally took us out of the Cold War and saved the world from its own headlong rush to mass suicide. We are not safe yet, but we are on our way, thanks to this one man. If there is ever a world medal, it should be given to Mikhail Gorbachev, who works quietly now to keep us on track and on our way out of danger. No other person in this whole world could have done this. Aldous told his mother that his ancestral father, 25,000 years ago, was Atlas, who ruled Atlantis for 500 years. Remember, the main stars, 7 main stars of the Pleiades, are named after the 7 daughters of Atlas. He also, these would be sisters of Aldous. He also told his mother that he was 250,000 years more advanced than her or Gorbachev, and that both Mikhail and Raisa were more ancient and evolved than their brother terrestrial human beings, who are also reliving an honorable mission, very difficult, but one which Mikhail will complete successfully. Mikhail and Raisa are both old souls and are from other worlds, he was told, much older and more evolved than this one. Mikhail is already prepared and activated for his new role in world affairs. And then came this mind blower. Aldous, in his discussions, that time came when, after the 3rd or 4th visit to the leaders' retreat in mid-Siberia, Gorbachev was overwhelmed with problems and everything, and he wanted to take a break from it. Aldous begged to go back to the ski slopes where he was injured before. So they went back there, and it was there he went for a walk with his father. His mother had fallen asleep. It was early in the morning, like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, when he asked his father to go for a walk with him. And they walked out into the cold morning. And there, at that time, Aldous explained to his father who he was, where he came from, who his superiors were, why they put him in the family, and that his mission was essentially completed, and that he would leave soon. He's not even 16 years old yet. So he discussed what had already happened with his father and reaffirmed the father's decisions, and that he was on the right track, and that it was according to plan, and that he had finished his mission in the family, and that he would return to Alcyone. So they hugged, said goodbye, went back to the house, and they returned to Moscow the following day. The helicopters came and picked them up. Now the next morning after that, Aldous persuaded his mother, talked to his mother, wanted to go back to the ski slopes again. He's already said goodbye to his father, and when they get back, he's loaded with affairs, and he's away from the house all day long and most of the evening, catching up with business again. And so the father agreed to send the helicopters and the mother and the boy back to the retreat for a couple more days. 3 days is what they decided on. So when the next morning, the helicopters took Rice and Aldous back to the retreat. They asked the caretakers to leave them alone for the 3 days, and to take the helicopters back to Moscow. And so Aldous and his mother were alone in the cabin, and then he explained to her what he explained to the father, the reason he was in the family, who put him there, how and why, and that his mission was essentially completed, and it was time for him to go back. And at that time then, he invited his mother to go meet the superiors that he kept referring to in Alcyone. And he, after a nice dinner, he arranged the couch, opened the couches into beds, and asked his mother to lay down, put his hand on her forehead, put her in an altered state of consciousness, and then took her to Alcyone with him to meet his superiors, where they observed many beautiful things and strange events happening there, and she got a full feeling of what was developing with the son, and was ready to accept his need to return to his parent society. And they came back, and he told her, after she woke up, he told her that about the trip, and then he told her that a mind blower. He said he referred to our military astronaut and test pilot Francis Dick Scobie, commander of the shuttle Challenger, which exploded over Florida on 28 January 1986, who declared to spiritual groups and the public in Unlimited Horizons, a USA magazine published in USA and Europe, that we continue living. And he's explaining to his mother now that the astronauts may have passed out of the physical body, but they continue living. And he explained that there are worlds with distinct manners of being and different modes of living with different manners of time, which is difficult for Earth humans to understand at first. And then Dick Scobie, he's quoting Dick Scobie, who says, "I had the good luck to be recognized by marvelous angels in the sky who said they knew who I was. Perhaps many of you are not prepared to believe this, but for me it simply is." Now this is Aldis is explaining to his mother. He may even be repeating it in the words of Dick Scobie. But anyway, he said, we crews are very united and have come to know that the world that ended for us in nothing was indeed the mission that we had to carry out, which we are realizing now and has cost us some, since we are very much identified with our titles, and it makes it difficult to accept that on this side, titles are not important. What is of value is God, and we want to help them to communicate with their God. For my companion, astronaut Ellison S. Onizuki, a major in the U.S. Air Force, an engineer with us, and pilot of an earlier shuttle mission, Discovery, of January 1985, was secretly aboard the Challenger. It was much easier for him, because of his Buddhist background and spiritual knowledge, to accept our new positions. When he crewed the shuttle Discovery there in the cosmos, which when on Earth he could not comment on because of his position, he told us, the Challenger crew, when he was in orbit aboard the Discovery, there was grave danger of not being able to put the ship in a proper orbit back toward Earth. The maneuvers were difficult to accomplish, and if not performed correctly, all aboard could die. At that time, the spirit of astronaut Virgil I. Grissom, who together with two other astronauts died in the fire aboard the Apollo capsule on 27 January 1967, came aboard and helped us magnificently to determine the correct angles for re-entry back to Earth. Now, he's already dead. All of this was filmed and recorded perfectly in the 4 film sequence cameras aboard at that time, each one of them operating independently and with different cameras. These films have now been destroyed. Let all of the groups of the world of our knowledge and belief confirm our existence. Now that was a summary of what Pedro Romniak wrote in the book Aldis. In the book, there's a lot of dialogue between Aldis and his parents that certainly was not conveyed at the time he met the Gorbachev family. When he finished his investigation in Voronezh, had seen all the evidence they wanted to show, he was invited to meet the Gorbachev family personally, where he met Mr. Gorbachev and Raisa, and they told him about their indigo son Aldis, who is now gone, but they described much of the events that he reported in the book. But when he was writing the book and he came to a need for dialogue, he would tune in and it would be transmitted to him in a form of automatic writing that he wrote rapidly until it ended. And so somebody else was furnishing the dialogue by some other means of transmission that rounded out the whole story about the dialogue between the boy and his father, and the dialogue between the boy and his mother, and all of the small details were added by this kind of automatic writing. So it's not entirely the work of Pedro Romniak, but it fleshes out the story of Aldis, which we have been unable to verify substantially in any way. We have no record of Aldis' birth. It's a good story. I believe Pedro Romniak was personally convinced that he saw the evidence. I've known Pedro for some 40 years, and he has no reason to lie about anything. And he was near the end of his life. He died the following February and is gone. We can't consult with him anymore. But his family confirmed that he was invited by the Russians, went at their expense on the tickets provided by them to Russia for 2 weeks. They furnished a translator that took care of him very well. He did meet the Gorbachev family. The rest of the putting the book together came in his own retreat there just outside of Buenos Aires as he sat down to write the story of Valdez, and much of it was transmitted automatically to him. So it's an interesting book. It's unverified, and I've been unable to make direct contact with Mikhail Gorbachev to get any feedback on this at all. And so all we have is Pedro Romniak's book, which I believe at this point is true. Now, there were some other interesting things that happened down there at Pedro Romniak's. We were having coffee and talking, and he told me that a young German author, researcher and author, Jan van Helsing, who had written a book on Nazi UFOs, had heard about the possible evacuation of one or more of the Kugelblitz sites, former German Nazi UFO research sites, they actually produced flying discs during the war, that one or more had been evacuated to South America and possibly to Argentina. And we have all collected information on a place called Colonia Dignidad on the west frontier of Argentina with Chile. And we know that Colonia Dignidad was a group of farms bought by German emigres who were given money by the German government to buy up tracts of land adjacent to each other to make a Germanic community in Argentina. And this happens to be the area where the giant caverns exist in the Andes Mountains down there that run for miles. They're so big it can push a railroad car down the cavern. And Lee and I have been in those. We've seen them. We know that they're there. We weren't in the ones in Chile, but we've seen them elsewhere in Peru and Ecuador. And so there are tunnels there big enough to take the Kugelblitz, one or more of the Kugelblitz factories, right there in Colonia Dignidad. So Jan van Helsing has gone out there to see what he can find out. He couldn't find anything about the Kugelblitz research there, but he did meet a number of Germans and was referred to a young man, an engineer that was working on a project there that he would not discuss with Van Helsing, but said he was told that he was born in New Berlin. New Berlin is the capital of New Schwabenland, the German colony in Antarctica. So Van Helsing took him to dinner to find out what he could about New Berlin, and he found some very interesting information. He found that New Berlin actually exists. It's really there, that it was populated by some 60,000 German troops that were sent down there in submarines during the war to build the colony, and that it had a population of 300,000 beings, all living underground in the geothermal facilities that were created there. There's a vast city of 300,000 people living there, living and growing up, and they produce all that they need right there. It's a perfectly formed city, perfectly organized. They don't have to import anything. And this young man told Van Helsing that about one fourth of the population of New Berlin are alien extraterrestrial beings living and working with the old Germans. The old Germans have died off, and they've been replaced by younger Germans. And one has to wonder about the size of the colony down there. But we learned during the close of the war that the Germans, when the Germans were in Russia, they took 20,000 Germanic women. They fit the outline of true Aryan women. They were blonde, blue-eyed, buxom women with good childbearing faculties or bodies. And they sent them to took them down to Antarctica. That's 20,000 now. And they took 20,000 German troops of the best Aryan stock and sent them down there also. Now they got a breeding colony down there in Antarctica that can produce all the labor that they need of true Aryan people. They're all blonde, blue-eyed Germans. And so the potentials are all there. There could be a city of 300,000, and this young man has just affirmed it to Jan van Helsing. So I found that very interesting because I've been following this Nazi UFO research for a very long time. I've got 2 books on it now. And compare notes and information with other researchers from all over the world. And I'm convinced that the Germans have continued their research. But a kind of an aside from that, when I was in Alaska way back in 1947, where my research began, and I was supervising a team of highly classified civilian laborers that were installing special equipment aboard the SAC B-29s that were flying their target profile missions on Russia. This team was installing more cameras. There were already cameras in every gun position on the B-29. And they were installing more cameras, including more 16mm cameras. There were handheld cameras, 35mm cameras. There were 4x5 press cameras. There was even a K-20, a Fairchild K-20 camera that took a picture on an 8" by 10" negative. All put aboard the B-29s along with surge detection equipment in the electrical systems. There were 5 electrical systems aboard the B-29. They put detectors in each of them. They put magnetic detectors, radio frequency detectors that would pick up the strongest emanation, the strongest broadcast signal, home on it for at least 30 seconds, record it, then cancel it and search for the next strongest one, home on it for 30 seconds and cancel it until the sweep was clean, and then it would start all over again for the whole 16 or 18 hours of the mission. We put cameras aboard the craft to take vertical pictures of the surface below. We had geothermal devices that measured the geothermal mapping, all kinds of things on as rider programs on that SAC requirement for the B-29 crews to fly a profile mission on their target at once every year. And so in my research, I heard stories of the crews coming on a 200-foot diameter silvery disc sitting on the Arctic snow pack and leaping in the air and flying away ahead of the B-29 and leaving no trace in the snow. When we launched the B-29, we had a sea of equipment around the B-29, bigger than the B-29. Water heaters that heated the oil system, the gas system, the fuel tanks, and the cabins. There was about 8 or 9 Herman Nelson heaters, big as a van. And there were there was fuel trucks, oil trucks, hydraulic trucks that all leaked. The hydraulic fluid was purple, and one of the gas was green, the oil was another color. And then we had all of this equipment and all these stains in the snow when the B-29 taxied out and took off. And here was something bigger than the B-29, left the ground with nothing on the ground, no equipment and no stains in the snow. So that was one event that was very impressive. There's nothing that we had that could do anything like that. Another crew reported coming on a silvery disc about 200 feet diameter sitting in the open Arctic Sea that submerged and disappeared as they approached and didn't come back out again. Another time they came on one that leaped into the air and flew away at high speed ahead of the B-29. So all of this was really exotic, and I was convinced that it was truly extraterrestrial because the Earth didn't have anything like this. But when I got into my Nazi UFO research, it turns out that the Germans had been working on their DISC program, the Brill and Haunebu programs, since before World War II. And that by the middle of the war, they had operational Haunebu 2s that were over 100 foot in diameter. And they were trying to wash one time with a hose that was under power, and they noticed that the water didn't hit the surface, bounced off. So they decided to try to land it in a big freshwater lake in central Austria. And when they landed, it settled into the lake and settled in the water. And the ship didn't wet. The water stood off from the ship in a force field of some kind. So the craft is now underwater flying like it flies in the air, but it was flying faster underwater than anything can travel underwater because it's developing no friction. And so now, with hindsight, I can see that my superiors who kept insisting that those are not extraterrestrials, and I kept saying they're insisting that there's some new technological development. I think that they already knew that when the Russians were advancing on Germany, driving the Germans home, and the Germans were desperately trying to evacuate their best technologies, and by the time the Germans were reversed and being driven home by the Russians, by that time the Germans had 9 Kugelblitz research facilities, all operational in Germany, and doing well. And they had 6 or 7 operational Haunebu 2 discs that could fly. And they decided in their strategy sessions over how to end the war, they decided to send a top-level emissary to try to negotiate an armistice. They sent Rudolf Hess to England. He was the #1 Nazi behind Hitler. And then they decided, as an alternate backup, they would send another top-ranking Nazi officer to South America to begin organizing the Fourth Reich. That was Martin Bormann, and he left South America. They decided on a third strategy session was to decentralize German industry, the bigger German industries, to South American capitals to produce an economic base for the new Fourth Reich. And the fourth was to dismantle the Kugelblitz, the best research facilities they had, and take them out of the country so they wouldn't fall into Allied hands, and they started dismantling and removing the Kugelblitz bases. They successfully carried 7 of them away. We never found a trace of them. The 8th one was in the process of being moved away when our troops arrived, and the Germans simply destroyed it and plowed it under, bulldozed it under. The 9th one was captured by the Russians intact. They were moving so fast that they captured the northern one, most northern one near the Russian border, intact, with work in progress, all the scientists and engineers there, and all the workers and their families there, and they carried the whole thing, workers and families, engineers and scientists, work in progress, machinery, everything from their cave, their cave installations there up into northern Siberia to the Taimyr Peninsula, which is above the tree line in northern Siberia, and put them all back underground in big underground facilities. So they were doing this from the end of World War II up until the time we were experiencing these events over the Arctic in North Alaska in 1947. So now, with hindsight, I am prepared to accept the possibility that what we were seeing and photographing in the Arctic at that time could have been Russian developments of the Nazi disc program that from the facility that was taken north into Siberia at the end of the war. And so these are remarkable stories, but we believe that that is in full operation, that the Russians are building operational discs from that technology now, and that the Nazis successfully evacuated the rest of the facilities except for the one, and they're someplace in South America. Researching the Nazi Kugelblitz programs, I had a number of correspondents I was working with in England, and a Polish man who had been writing me about the Kugelblitz programs in Poland told me that his father worked, or his father's brother worked in one of the Kugelblitz factories, and told him this story, that on one of our carpet bombing raids, and one of the big ones had 800 bombers in the air, all in one bombing mission, and it could have been either the ball bearing plants or the Plosti oil fields, I don't remember which. But he said that night, with 800 bombers in the air, all of the German fighters that made approaches on that formation were shot down because the bombers were aligned in such a way that every inch of space around the formation was covered by somebody's gun. But in order to do that, they had to fly wingtip to wingtip and nose to tail to get full coverage. So they were flying that kind of a formation, and they shot down all the attacking airplanes, except they lost 200 of the bomber fleet, 1/4 of the bomber fleet in one night, over 3,000 crews, all killed in one night. So when the surviving airplanes got back, the crews were all separated and interviewed separately to find out what the hell could have happened. We shot down all the airplanes and lost 1/4 of the fleet. And they found that a number of the crewmen reported seeing big explosions in the sky, and sometimes some of them reported the silhouette of a disc at an angle silhouetted in the explosion. And this was one clue. Another one was that engines would lose power, and because of the tight formation they were flying, if an engine misfired, that airplane would back into the one behind it, who would back into the one behind that, or if they turned out either way, they hit airplanes on the side. So there were collisions in the formation all over the place as a result of losing power. So that a Polish engineer told me that there were 9 Kugelblitz, 9 Haunebu 2s available that night. The Germans used 6 on the formation, attacking the formation. They didn't have any weapons. They had two devices aboard. One was called a Motorstoffel, which is nothing more than an electromagnetic beam that interrupts ignition circuits. And the other was a benzene aerosol bombs that were just dropped ahead of the formation with this vent open, and they created a benzene cloud. When the bomber formation flew into it, the exhaust fumes ignited it. It would take out a half a dozen bombers at a time. So that's the only weapons that were used. There were no guns aboard those Hanabus. But with those two weapons, they brought down 1/4 of that bomber fleet. The course of the war could have changed that night. But before the end of that week was out, the same week, all the Hanabus left Germany and never came back. That was where our investigation started. Where did they go? So we had this confirmation of how we lost 1/4 of a carpet bombing fleet one night, almost turned to change the tide of war. And that was the explanation the Polish guy gave us. Thank you very much. So we find this all to be remarkable information. There's not a whole lot we can do about it, but it serves as a confirmation for a lot of other similar information that's developing now that tends to reinforce what I just told you. And so with that, I guess I'll have to bid you goodbye and tell you that the reason I am doing this by tape is because I am a little short of breath at this time because I'm about with pneumonia about 6 months ago, and I have to take oxygen a lot of the time, and I got to get on some in a little bit here. So I wish you a very interesting and successful visit to our facility here, and thank you very much, folks. Goodbye.